Only so long as we work in harmony with nature's laws may we continue to reap a bountiful harvest. Who shall have the right to disregard these laws? Who shall have the right to misuse this vital earth?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Decrypting Crypto podcast, a CastBox original show. I'm Austin Knight, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Matthew Howells-Barbie.
Hey, Austin. Hey, everyone. If there's one thing that we've learned so far about the blockchain space, it's the ones making the majority of the money are those controlling most of the money. And in this case, the mining companies and the crypto exchanges. Kind of sounds a little like our current financial system, right?
Well, the CEO of Binance, currently the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, recently said that the company had made $200 million in profit in Q2. That doesn't sound quite so good compared to the Bitmain numbers, but when you consider that that's a 2,757% increase when compared to the $7.5 million profit that Binance made in Q1, it starts to sound pretty amazing.
I think this is going to be a major hurdle for the entire blockchain industry to overcome in the long term, in all honesty. On one hand, we're championing decentralization, and then on the other, we're actually fueling centralization by continuing to actually use these centralized cryptocurrency exchanges.
And the more that time goes on, the tougher this will get to turn around.
Yeah, that's right. This is definitely something we're going to dive into in a future episode. And I know we have touched on this a little bit before, but especially as we start to shine a light on decentralized exchanges, which is what many believe to actually be the solution to this problem, but they do actually also come with some of their own challenges.
Right. That'll make for a discussion, though.
Yeah, and it's worth also noting at this point that alongside releasing new podcast episodes each week, we also send out a weekly newsletter, and that'll help you keep up to date with all of the latest headlines, talking points from the past week. So if you are actually interested in getting some of this news straight to your inbox, you can subscribe completely for free at thecoinoffering.com/crypto-news. So once again, that's thecoinoffering.com/crypto-news.
It's also worth calling out that we compile the newsletter ourselves each week, and we don't share your data with anyone, nor do we ever include any promotions in the emails.
Yeah, I'm sure you all have enough spam in your inbox for us to start adding to it. So, yeah, join the list, and you'll never have to scour through Reddit again. At least not for crypto news.
So, who are we talking with today, Matt?
I'm glad you asked, Austin. So, all this talk of making millions and billions got me slightly distracted. We're going to be talking to Colin Stewart today, and Colin is the director of Agrotechnoecology, say that 10 times, one after the other, at Producers Token. A job title like that pretty much secures the fact that you know your shit, right? Director of Agrotechnoecology. Pretty sweet title. So, awesome title to one side. Producers Token is a project that has the modest vision of completely revolutionizing the agricultural supply chain.
We've talked a little in Series 1 about the various industries that are ripe for change with blockchain, and the food industry was always one that came up. So Keith should be a great person to get some answers from.
Well, we'll soon find out. Colin, welcome to the Decrypting Crypto podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Hey, Colin. So why don't you start out by giving us a little background on Producers Token and telling our listeners what the project is all about?
Yeah, so Producers Token is a company and concept that came out of years of experience farming and engaging the larger agribusiness economy. And really two facts. One of which is that people have been producing agricultural products, have been treated unfairly in history, and are largely subject to global markets. And two, it's actually surprisingly difficult to purchase directly from the source of agricultural production because of consolidated market powers or consolidated markets themselves. So Producers Token is actually a security token that is building a global platform that empowers farmers and agricultural producers using digital tools. And really, we think of it as like a digital toolkit. And some of these digital tools include, but aren't limited to, digital marketing, smart contracts, integration of distributed ledger technologies, and subsequent cryptocurrencies.
Okay, interesting. So how did your personal story kind of evolve, and how did you get involved in the blockchain space and this kind of cross-section between agriculture and blockchain?
Yeah, I actually got into blockchain through agriculture, believe it or not. So
not necessarily the typical path for the people that we speak to.
yeah, right. So I was actually farming wheat in Southwest Washington, and I was looking for a particular, Washington State that is, and I was looking for a particular variety of wheat, and I couldn't find it. And it was a really small amount. It was about 1 metric ton. I was only planting about 20 acres or so. And I thought it was really absurd because Washington State exports about 95% of the wheat it produces. And I thought it was really bizarre that I couldn't find this really small ton of wheat. And I was looking for wheat that wasn't treated with a chemical fungicide because I was growing in an organic production system.
Mm-hmm.
So that just really frustrated me. So I ended up creating a company that was essentially building a peer-to-peer marketplace for organic grains, and not really just organic grains, but any grains that any buyer or seller wanted to list. So that company then merged and started collaborating with Producers Market about 6 months ago. So that company kind of got combined into Producers.
Interesting. So you were actually part of that merger then, and this is where those two worlds have now collided?
Yeah, and I started really studying the Ethereum blockchain and really Bitcoin itself and all the other ERC20 tokens. And I also started looking at a lot of the directed acyclic graph technologies like Hashgraph.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously there's power there, right? The idea that, we can distribute a ledger and we can really enable peer-to-peer transactions. As my sophistication of the space has evolved, I've really realized that a lot of blockchain technologies aren't actually a good solution and fit for what we're doing. So we've actually landed on a new architecture, and we'll be announcing a partnership soon with a company called Holochain. I don't know if you're familiar, but
yep.
So they actually present a model of cryptographic accounting that is really unique to the space, and we've really landed on that as being the pathway forward for our platform.
That's interesting, and I want to dive into some of the specifics around some of this technology, but before we do that, I'm quite intrigued around the roots, if you like, coming from the agriculture industry. And we've personally talked on the podcast quite a bit about the different industries that blockchain is colliding with. And one that continually came up in amongst several others was the food industry. And it seems to me like Producers Token really has quite a grand vision, right, of ultimately turning the supply chain within the agriculture and food industry on its head. And could you just help our listeners understand why this is even necessary in the first place? Like, what is it that's wrong with the current system that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, great question. So I like to root the answer to this question in history. So, our current agricultural system is really globalized and really beholden to global producers and global prices and global markets. And I like to tie this back to really I'm using air quotes so you can't see, the discovery of America by the Spanish, right, by Christopher Columbus. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish to the Americas, the top traded commodities, many of the systems of exchanges were actually using foods as currency. So the First Nations of the West Coast of California actually traded acorns and sea salt as a currency. Mayan cultures used cacao as a really common currency. There were 10,000-mile roads that the Incas built that facilitated extensive barter and economic exchanges from Cahokia, which is now modern-day Minneapolis, all the way down to South America. So when the Spanish came, they introduced really double-entry bookkeeping and fiat currency that really stripped away a lot of the knowledge and really economic systems that had flourished for millennia And I make the argument that our current agricultural system is still kind of reeling from this introduction of currency and these introduction of beliefs, and also the introduction of crops that really are foreign to this environment. So with that kind of erasure of systems of exchange and barter, we are still subscribed to a lot of these agricultural systems that often don't place the people who are actually creating the value in the center. We often externalize the people who have stewarded this knowledge or these histories of exchange and kind of push them aside for maybe different biases or motives.
And just to clarify, when you're talking about those people being pushed aside, are you referring to the farmers and the producers?
Yes, and mostly the farmers, but we really define producers as anyone who's creating an agricultural product. But of course, farmers are the ones who are creating the raw goods and resources that all the other products depend upon.
When we talk a lot about the incorrect balance of value and benefits in supply chains, which is a continuous thread that we tend to touch upon whenever we're talking about blockchain in particular, it's often about disintermediation that a lot of the talking points come around. Is that a big piece? I know from some early conversations that we've had and from even just some of the core vision and values that you see on the Producers Token website, it seems a real goal here is to deliver more value to the farmers themselves and provide less to these somewhat unnecessary third parties and intermediaries that are in this supply chain. Would that be a fair assumption?
Mostly. How we view it is that some intermediaries provide incredible value, right? We have processors, shippers, handlers, distributors that really make the supply system work. That being said, there are often many of those intermediaries, and often many of those intermediaries aren't actually providing a fair value or a fair exchange to the producers. So we like to say that we are actually just making the value flow visible in the value chain and not necessarily cutting out all of the intermediaries, but more of creating a platform for the intermediaries who provide the most value, for that value to be seen and visible.
And in practicality, what does that look like, right? So for an intermediary to specifically have their value being shown more, not necessarily having any value taken away, is there any trade-off at all that we're talking about here? And how do we facilitate the highlight of value from an intermediary?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. You have to distribute your goods often, especially in a global market. Often there isn't just one distributor. There could be, 1 to 5 to 10 to 100, depending on your region. It's really hard and has been historically difficult for producers to know which distributor is going to give them the best deal. So the idea is that all of the distributors could stake their prices directly to the producer, and the producer would now have the ability to choose which distributor is going to give them the best deal.
Right, okay. So it kind of opens up a lot more options within the entire kind of, I guess, transaction process. Would that be a fair thing to say?
That's articulate. Well said.
Okay, so this is I'm starting to unravel this as a bit of a puzzle right now for myself. So I'm kind of almost thinking out loud with some of this. But when we talk a little bit about being able to give, for example, the farmers more options, and it seems like ultimately with Producers Token, it's like you're building a marketplace in amongst all of this that creates opportunities for distribution for the farmers and highlights the different options they have available.
As well as a marketing platform, correct?
Right, got it. And is there any risk that's put up against any of these intermediaries that, it would seem like for those intermediaries that are involved in current supply chains, these are not small little businesses. These are huge global corporations that have a lot of buying power. And it would seem to me that being in a situation where they are then put up against increased competition could be seen as a risk to them. Do you see there being much of a fight back from the intermediary companies, or do you think that this is going to actually deliver more value for them and they'll embrace it?
It's a good question. Agriculture is a consumer-driven market. right? It's an interesting market because it's really personal. It's what we choose to put in our mouths and our bodies is ultimately where the market will go, right? If everybody in the United States demanded that, they were to eat eggs that were fed USDA certified organic grain today, then you'd see almost every egg producer convert to those practices.
That would be a pretty wonderful outcome, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to all of that. I'm not proposing either way or disposing the other way, but I think there is risk, but that's also a lot of what these companies do, right? There is value in intermediaries who, give insurance and will buy, a bunch of lettuce from a producer and repackage it and sell it, right? And then, we have some kind of corporate structures in the way that limit liability. But what I think a lot of this especially this distributed ledger technology does is it allows us to see who has risk and if is the risk evenly or justly distributed. So I feel like the answer to your question is yes and or no and. It's both.
So let's talk about this on a slightly more practical level without getting too technical, of course. What would the process look like for a farmer using Producer's Token to sell some of their produce?
Yeah, so it would look a lot like a really simple to use mobile app. I don't know if listeners have ever used like a Amazon application, but essentially we would provide producers with a very simple way for them to list their good online on our Producers Market platform and a mobile app. And that listing would then be immediately accessible to all the buyers in our ecosystem. So it wouldn't look much different than a traditional marketplace application. Where a blockchain comes in or a distributed ledger comes in is that theoretically you could then choose as the producer or the buyer to make visible as much of the information about that purchase as you wish. So here's a good actually way to pivot about why we've actually focused not to use blockchain technology itself, but another distributed ledger technology, Holochain, is that blockchain technology really requires the whole network to undergo what we call forced consensus. So a blockchain, right, is just a centralized ledger that everybody in the network has to agree upon the order of events. For our use case, this doesn't really make sense because imagine that you are an avocado grower in the Michoacan in Mexico. Why should everybody in the network have to agree that you sold your avocados? Right? If I'm an apple grower in Washington State selling my apples, why should I have to know that the avocado grower in the Michoacan sold his avocados? Sure, you could say, well, it'd be interesting to see what, the total rate of avocados, the price of those avocados, but ultimately that's the producer's data, right? That's the producer's agency and arguably their autonomy to be able to disclose that information. So we like to say if we're empowering a platform of producers, we shouldn't force them to do anything they don't want to do. And actually a problem with blockchain technologies and philosophy, and also objectively the reason why blockchain can't scale, and that it's very inefficient because it forces this consensus across the entire network.
To play devil's advocate there, it feels like to me that actually the situation you've described there, we've got one piece, right, where I would agree that when that initial data of the avocado grower, we don't really need necessarily people all around the world to agree that the avocado came from that farm and the various data points that are going with the initial transaction. However, one area that I do see benefits is as further transactions occur further down the supply chain is ensuring that that data is not altered and changed so that it could ultimately have the origin or source changed from where it came from to maybe make it organic when it was non-organic, for example. And that's where I see one element of blockchain and having that immutable forced consensus to an extent, ledger being valuable. What's kind of your counter argument there in terms of like, why not make it radically transparent like that?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's just that if you're not involved in that actual supply chain transaction and you're not involved in, say, the end purchase of those avocados, it's really inefficient for you to be able to see that whole network, or that whole transaction chain. Theoretically, you can still do that with this cryptographic accounting that holochain presents, but it's not necessary for the whole network to validate it for it to happen. So you can still have that transparency, that all what you're explaining is still there in the system. It just doesn't require everybody in the network to validate that transparency.
Right. So is what we're describing here more of a private distributed ledger technology?
No, it's actually what's called an agent-centric model. So we can say that a blockchain is data-centric because there's a centralized ledger that we all have to agree upon. What holochain does is it actually pushes, so everybody has their own chain, and it's actually a combination of distributed hash tables, hashing like we see in the Bitcoin algorithm, and signatures. So everybody has their own chain, their private chain, their local chain, and then there's actually a center chain as well.
I see.
Yeah, it's much more dynamic. It's quite interesting, and I would encourage if you could send a link so your listeners could look at it.
Yeah, we'll make sure that we put some stuff in the show notes around that. I have to say I'm not particularly familiar with that technology, in all honesty, so I'll make sure I do some reading up. Where we talk about individual users having their own chain, is that so that they can keep some of their information confined to themselves versus putting it on more of a public, open-facing, like central chain?
Correct. Because, there's some information that we really don't want out. Like, there's a bunch of indigenous communities in the Amazon that really are now engaging in global markets, and sometimes we don't want everybody to know where they are, right? There's specific use cases that, it also comes down to philosophy, right? Like, autonomy and agency and privacy over your own data and what we do, right? That's kind of a fundamental difference where blockchain kind of forces everybody to be fully transparent, at least in the transactions that they engage in, which I think is great for some use cases, but very few when you really get down to it. There's a really great article, actually. It's called Holochain versus Hashgraph and When Consensus is Needed in Distributed Computing.
Right.
And the argument is that it's very, very infrequently, actually.
Interesting. I'll make sure we share that out in the show notes. I know that Hashgraph was something that myself and Austin were talking a little bit around near the end of last year. It got a number of headlines. I think it's had its fair share of controversy. A lot of people that are very anti-private chains get quite annoyed about it, but I definitely am not necessarily of that opinion. I think there's a place for all kinds of technology in this ecosystem. So, yeah, we'll dig into that. One thing I just want to shift gears a little bit here without getting too bogged down in some of the technical stuff. I'm interested to know, we talked a bit about the farmers, the producers, the intermediaries within the supply chain. Is there any value to the end consumer with Producers Token? Is there anything that would change for them? Any additional benefits, downsides for the end consumer here?
Yeah, so we're starting with a B2B platform, business to business, but there's really nothing stopping people today from even contacting a farmer and buying directly from them. Like, in the States here, we could buy, loads of grain directly from farmers, and we're going to get a much better rate. And also within our roadmap, we intend on opening up retail stores. That's kind of at the, after we do our B2B and B2C platforms. But that's the idea, right, is that consumers of all types can access these agricultural producers directly, which will see a much better price and, much closer connection to where food is being produced.
And when you talk about a much better price, is that because you gain a greater efficiency across the whole supply chain?
Yeah, and it's more direct. Correct. Exactly.
So my own personal journey here, over the past 4 years, I've lived in 3 different countries. In England, I lived in Ireland, and now I live in the US. And when I was living in Ireland, in Dublin, which is like everything revolves around agriculture there. I think one of the top university degrees is within agriculture, and it's the main pillar of the economy there. And the access to local farm produce, connections with farmers, it was actually just as easy as being able to sign up to food delivery services in the US, like Blue Apron, etc. But I find in the US that connection between farm to table, and I would argue as well, even in the UK, it seems a lot more distant to me. Do you have that feeling as to why that is?
Yeah, boy, that's a deep question.
I've really thrown a casual question out there that's probably quite a big one to unravel.
I mean, to me, it goes back to looking at our history, right? It goes back to looking at the natural resources that have always been here, and also just the lack of respect for really indigenous knowledge and the communities and cultures and food systems that preceded the inception of the United States. Yeah, I mean that's all. That's all it is.
Avoiding any further controversy. I like it.
Well, I mean, I think it says a lot, right? It's succinct. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the proliferation of diet-related disease, we're seeing that this it's becoming a meme, right? Like this idea of eating healthily, eating close to home, eating locally. It is becoming a meme because it's necessitated by the market conditions and also human health. Right. So the demand for organic food is way outpacing the supply right now. The United States is now a gross importer of organic goods. So it's trending, right? It's coming along. I'm quite optimistic because we look at the market, it's where the market's going. In 2016, USDA organic sales were 80 billion worldwide. They're forecasted to be 320 billion by 2025.
Wow.
It's coming. People are really picking up on it. And blockchain is so interesting, or blockchain technologies, because, it's creating this method of radical transparency when people are demanding radical transparency, which is, I like to think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's both interesting and, for really the first time in a long time, is forcing people to think a little bit differently, not just around industries like agriculture, but pretty much in every single aspect of the way that you consider the core things that you do in your life. And that's one of the things I do like about blockchain technology and all of the surrounding technologies, even more so than the tech itself. I think it's forcing people to think a bit more about some of the decisions they make.
Yeah, it's a tool to reassess where we hold value and what's trustworthy and what's just. And that's, arguably the most exciting, or the best positive attributes of the technology.
For sure. And I have a question a bit around, so clearly there's value in this platform. I think some of the things you've touched on are really interesting. One question I do have, and this is a similar theme of a question that I tend to ask a lot of people that we interview on the podcast. And so this all seems great, and it seems like for this platform to really take off, you need to have people actually using it. And with the fact that you've got farmers seeming to be a primary focus group of people that you want to have come on board and use this technology ultimately, I feel like there's going to be a lot of challenges in getting the farming community to even understand this technology. And that's no slight on the farming community. I think that even the most technologically savvy people are going to struggle comprehending a lot of the different various blockchain and surrounding distributed ledger technologies. So do you see this as a big hurdle for Producers Token? And if so, like how do you plan on tackling that?
Yeah, great question. So a few things. One, a lot of these projects will live and die by their user experience and user interface. Two, it really depends on where you are globally as far as your, technological literacy or even technological connectivity. I know some farmers in the US who are heavily invested in the crypto space. And really, I think it's pretty universal in the United States that a lot of farmers know that they're being taken advantage of. And I don't think that's just endemic within the US. And, three, a lot of business is already done using the tools that, like the technology tools that we have. Like WhatsApp is actually one of the most used platforms for selling agricultural goods in countries all around the world. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is funny, right? And, even in LinkedIn, I get I was just looking at organic grains from a Punjabi friend of mine.
You have some very different LinkedIn messages to the ones I get.
Yeah. Well, I scraped all the data from the organic database and invited everybody, but that's a different story. So, and another thing is that over the next few years, all these, there's a lot of companies launching those low Earth orbiting satellites, but we're going to see 2 billion more people come online in the next, I think, what is it, by 2025 again? And something that is really exciting to me is that a lot of these people coming onto the internet will never know an internet before the use of distributed ledgers, right? That to me is fascinating, is that there's a lot of people in the world who are not connected, but when they get connected, they're going to have access to really good tools. And again, I think it goes back to this idea of, as long as the user interface and user experience is simple and great, then it should be easier to use than WhatsApp, easier to use than Facebook, easier to use than whatever you have, and easier to explain than all those as well.
It sounds like the takeaway here is that you're focused on not overwhelming the users with technical information, but instead just providing them with a simple and easy to use interface, which I love.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, at the end of the day, if producers are getting paid better, they're going to use a service, right? And if they're already, it's really hard to change human behavior and human patterns, but people are already selling their goods, right? So if you can provide a platform for them to sell it in a different way that gives them more value, then it's almost a surefire thing that people will use it.
Absolutely. And that to one side, one area that the technology probably won't be able to be shielded with a nice user interface is price volatility. This is something that I know a lot of projects struggle with, especially in the early days, where if the farmers are ultimately carrying out transactions with cryptocurrency and a native token, there is going to probably be a lot of volatility in the price, something that they're probably not used to with traditional fiat currencies like US dollar, the euro, pound sterling, etc. How do you plan on tackling this, educating the farmers, and even combating some of the challenges they're going to face?
Yeah, so we won't use a blockchain-based token, really.
Right, okay.
They're so volatile that we know we can't use them. Like, we actually, as a use case, we facilitated an agricultural exchange using the Stellar blockchain. And by the time it was all said and done, the price of that token had dropped by 15 or 20%, right? So that it's just not useful. So again, I'm going to make a plug for Holochain, is that their method of cryptographic accounting allows for the creation of asset-backed cryptocurrencies. And this is really interesting, right? Because what we're designing and implementing our platform is a method for agricultural producers to mint their own cryptocurrencies that are actually backed by their goods. So you can think of the cryptocurrency that as a forward contract, essentially, and that people can bid on this forward contract and get the cryptocurrency that they can hold in their wallet. Right? And this cryptocurrency actually has a real value. It's backed. They paid a certain price for it that can be in whatever currency that the producer desires. And then they can then cash in or exchange their cryptocurrency that's backed by the asset when that asset is ready to be harvested or picked up or processed when it's been processed.
So you're kind of ultimately tokenizing those assets.
Token is an interesting word because token implies an abstraction, right? So where, for instance, producer's token is an abstraction of shares in a company, right? So it is still backed by the shares in the company. We like to talk about it as currency creation. So it's not really tokenization, it's actually creation of a currency that's backed by the asset. And this is a lot of language that Holochain talks about. It came out of a project called the Metacurrency Project that was started about 15 years ago. And the creator, Arthur Brock, is really brilliant. He talks about currencies not as, CURRENCY, but talks about currency, like seeing the current, seeing the flows of the ocean and the water. And he argues that a good currency makes value flows visible. So it's not necessarily a token or an abstraction of the asset itself. It's actually a representation of the asset itself. So there's a slight distinction there where token says that there's an abstraction in there. There's an abstraction level, where a currency or an asset-backed cryptocurrency is actually the asset, just a representation, but not an abstraction of the asset. So there's a slight nuance there, but it's really important because if we look at the crypto tokens, all the ERC20 tokens, I think we're up to 1,700 cryptocurrencies.
Yep, and that's probably going to double over the next year, I would imagine.
Yeah, and most of them will fail, right?
Yep.
Because if you look at it, most of them are not actually backed by anything real. I mean, you can say Bitcoin is backed by the mining power and the mining capacity and the networks, but the actual value of it is mostly floating, and that's why they're so volatile.
Yeah, I think that's something we could probably spend a good couple of hours debating around, but I think we've probably got enough to unpack within this interview. Well, Colin, it's been super interesting chatting with you around this. Before we close this off, why don't you let our listeners know where they'd be able to follow you, get in touch, learn more about yourself and Producers Token?
Yeah, so we're on Instagram, Telegram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And I guess the most active and engaged discussions happening right now are on Telegram. We have a really cool community talking to farmers actually in our Telegram. So it's a good example of what we're doing. And that's t.me/producers token. And you can find us on our website at producersmarket.com and also producerstoken.com.
Awesome. Well, Colin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, and we'll make sure we share out a bunch of those things that you mentioned within the show notes as well. But thanks again for your time. It's been really interesting.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to show your appreciation to me and Austin, make sure you subscribe and leave us a review on the CastBox app or on your favorite podcasting platform. We'd really appreciate it. If you haven't already, make sure you download the free CastBox app, where you'll find us as one of the CastBox original shows. You can also visit thecoinoffering.com to learn more about cryptocurrencies, get caught up on some news, see how your currency is performing, and you can finally follow us on Twitter at thecoinoffering. Lastly, but not leastly, you can ask us any questions you have by emailing us at podcast@thecoinoffering.com.
The Decrypting Crypto podcast is a CastBox original show, and its content should not be used and are not intended as investment advice. Please do your own due diligence before making any investment, cryptocurrency or otherwise.